The next speaker I'd like to introduce to you is Natasha Lipman. Natasha is a chronic illness blogger, and she's going to tell us about her experience and story. But she now actively writes and blogs about her own personal experiences, but also going forward the dangers of the world of wellness. Okay, over to Natasha. Thank you, Natasha.
Hi, I hope you don't mind that I'm sitting instead of standing, but you will understand why in a little bit. I might get up and move my body around in weird ways, and I might go blank for a bit, but please bear with me. I'm going to start this off with a little bit of a spoiler. Going vegan, gluten-free, sugar-free, low histamine, high nutrient, anti-inflammatory, organic, and having a rotation diet did not cure me of my chronic invisible disabilities, which I know must be an absolute shocker to everyone sitting in this room. It was high on restriction, low on joy, and the most overwhelming result of this was adding another condition to my list, orthorexia. I know a lot of you probably started cringing by the time I got to sugar-free, but for me, at the time, this diet offered me something that no doctor or dietitian had. It offered me hope. That's why today I'd like to talk a little bit about why people fall for wellness and why it's important that we don't dismiss anyone as just stupid for falling for these trends. Last week, someone sent me an article about clean eating and orthorexia, where he described it as a misplaced obsession of the affluent. While I agree with this up to a point, I believe looking at wellness through this sphere can be extremely short-sighted and trivialize a lot of important issues. Of course, there are many people who turn to wellness who have no problems. The Goops of the world profit by selling unending illness, and girls with genes a lot more desirable than mine hawk restrictive diets as a secret to the body beautiful that most people will never attain. But I turn to wellness for a completely different reason. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder, and I've had it pretty much my whole life. When I was in my mid-20s, I developed two new conditions that suddenly made my piddly one, which pretty normal, I think, had frequent dislocations, subluxations, chronic pain and fatigue, feel like a walk in the park. I passed out when I sat up, I passed out when I tried to eat, and that was thanks to POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and ME, which was extra chronic fatigue, which didn't really mean anything extra to me at the time. And I became pretty intolerant to what felt like everything. I became intolerant to the smells outside so much that I nearly passed out going outside, and histamine intolerance can be a very difficult thing to handle when you become intolerant to your own digestive system. After exhausting all the medical options, as I was unfortunately that rare person who reacted terribly to the miracle medication, I drove headfirst into a deep torrid affair with Dr. Google, and I fell hard for the promises of wellness. Never-ending propaganda promised me that if I just changed my diet, I'd cure myself, just like the glossy girls on my Instagram feed gushed that they had. Some of them apparently even had the same illnesses that I had, and they managed to cure themselves, no problem. At the beginning, I started to feel a bit better. All I did every day was read about food, talk about food, and prepare food. My house absolutely stunk of juiced broccoli, and I still have to apologize to my mother for that. And my entire purpose in life was to cure myself with food. I can laugh about it now, but it's actually really sad. I genuinely believed that the food that I was eating had the ability to poison me, and I was absolutely terrified of making myself more unwell than I already was. So while we look at people turning to wellness as a problem of the middle class with too much time on their hands, wanting to fit their perfect arse into 150-pound Lululemon leggings, it's important to recognise that a lot of people turn to diet cures out of desperation. It's hard to admit that you may never get better, and for me, food felt like a what's the harm sort of thing that I could use to try and feel in control of a situation that was spinning completely out. Testimonials are enticing, especially before you learn that there's no evidential value there. And obsessive reading, Instagramming, and Netflix documentaries had ingrained the message in my brain that the food we eat has an insane power over our health, and every single bite we take is a choice to either feed your sickness or return your body to its natural state of health. That being said, these people have never met my body in its natural state, but I think that's something slightly different. I ended up believing that any fluctuation in my health and my chronic and incurable health was my own fault. I know that now that it is pseudo-religious bollocks, but it's easy to believe if you'll grasp onto anything to feel better, and people will actively message you on social media if you eat something that they deem as making you worse, and that was a very fun time in my life. As humans are wont to do, I failed to make a connection between my decrease in symptoms and coming off of the meds that made me feel like I was dying. I didn't associate it with the natural fluctuation of these conditions and a myriad of other things that I won't bore you with today. As I continued, at first buoyed by my success, the subsequent flare-ups over the next few years confused me and made me feel like I was failing. The glossy girls did this and they were cured, so why wasn't I? The worst part was, since I was sharing my journey on Instagram, people also felt like they had a right to comment on the strengths and weaknesses of my current diet, as well as the supposed negative attitude that was standing in my way of a cure. I was doing something wrong, I wasn't pure enough, I wasn't extreme enough, and the thing standing in my way was the fact that I didn't believe that I could get better. People have literally called me up to tell me this, and I've heard them more times than I would like to recount. I didn't know what to do, so I kept switching between diets, becoming more and more extreme before going on extreme binges. I kept trying because I was so desperate to be well and live the life of a normal 20-something. And it wasn't until I spent thousands of pounds on the Institute of Integrative Nutrition, which if you know, you'll probably all turn your nose up at, and I am embarrassed to admit it, but that's when I realised that most of what I was doing was complete nonsense, which was not quite their intended outcome, but it worked for me. Being taught by the very people whose messages I'd been reeled in by, I realised how much of it was nonsense. The more I read and listened, the more I realised that most of these people had no qualification to talk about nutrition. The final nail in the coffin came after an argument with one of my coaches in the mandatory Skype sessions where I was disagreeing with some advice on a scientific basis. And she told me that we had to agree to disagree because feelings and religion were just as valid as facts when giving health advice, and apparently it was something that I needed to respect. Over the years, I've tried so many different diets. I've read all the books, I did a raw food challenge that left my stomach so bloated I couldn't move, and a girl I know gushed to me over the phone that 80-10-10 was finally the answer to her chronic illness after one day of guzzling down more fruit than people eat while being on an exotic island for a month. She was absolutely hopped up on sugar after being on a candid and no sugar diet for months before that. It's not about any one diet, but it's about our wider relationship with food, how to ensure everyone has the fundamental scientific knowledge to battle woo and pseudoscience and long-term treatment for long-term health conditions, a more responsible media, which, good luck, and the way we treat each other online. The plant-based, raw, paleo goop conversation has been and will be replaced by whatever is the new sexy reason that people misinterpret a study, which explains why we're all fat and sick. A lot of people, myself included, find it easy to deride people for believing fads, misunderstanding science and following these trends, but I believe it's important to address reasons why. I was not much into science at school, but I consider myself an intelligent and critical thinking person. I fell for all the diet woo because I was desperate. At the time, I was literally intolerant to most things, so along with wanting to be better, I genuinely couldn't eat more than a few foods, so it felt like a reasonable track to go down. And this is where the quacks are able to prosper. These messages are propagated in a way that is so enticing, and it's important that we keep this in mind when we try to tackle it. We need to continue to share proper evidence from qualified professionals in ways that are easy to understand and attractive to the general population who don't have the time that many of us have to spend on Twitter looking for the real evidence. After all, a balanced diet and a lot of water doesn't sound very sexy, and it doesn't offer the quick fix solutions that people are after. I'm lucky that I managed to escape it, although I wish it hadn't cost me a few £1,000s in course fees and thousands more in supplements, appointments and tri-weekly grocery food shops to Whole Foods. And all that remains of that time is self-blame whenever I have a flare-up. As a sick person, these messages are really hard to avoid. They come from people innocently sharing their journey, people commenting and wanting to help because it supposedly healed them, and these cures that are usually pretty high up on a Google search when you're looking for support. It takes a lot of strength to avoid them, and it takes a lot of evidence that most people just don't have access to. We must never underestimate the desperation or deride people who are looking for hope. Yes, seeing these wellness people splashed across our newspapers or smiling inanely on television can be extremely frustrating to those in the know. But to those who don't, it gives these messages a sheen of respectability. Why would they get all of this coverage if they were dangerous and propagating false messages? The more we can debunk them, and that's for more people than I am, the better. But in order to understand these quacks, understand why these quacks are able to prosper, we need to understand the multitude of reasons that people are drawn to them in the first place, and it's not quite as simple as it looks at first glance. When it comes to people like me who got caught up, we need to look at the holistic care for long-term conditions. Although treatment might be limited to the very limited research that's already out there, many of us are just left to get on with it, with no guidance or support for figuring out how to live, let alone how to exist. With proper care, consideration, and most importantly, people who truly listen, don't deride and take time to actually care about their patients, we can do a lot to help people from desperately looking elsewhere for help. I was once sent to a dietitian who was an expert in FODMAPs, and it was when I couldn't really eat anything, and she was telling me to eat the foods that I had severe reactions to and cut out the only ones that I could eat safely at the time. I felt patronised and not listened to, sorry. I'm all for taking advice and following experts, but as someone who has spent more time in hospital than anyone should, I know when I'm being ignored or treated like a tick box exercise. I've had my EDS diagnosis questions because I'm not hypermobile in my thumbs, and have had experts push drugs on me that have already made me worse than anything else. It's made me an expert at knowing which medical professionals actually listen and care and which don't. And I think for a lot of people, this is one of the biggest issues of why they turn to people like naturopaths and homeopaths, because we're not treated with the respect that we deserve. It's sad when a positive experience is the exception rather than the norm. I know it's a huge funding issue and there's no easy answer, but our system is broken and it's where wellness can seep in. Last week, someone messaged me saying, "It looks like you've got a lot of the diet healing stuff figured out. Can you give me advice?" When I refused and told them to see a dietitian, they messaged me privately, talking about the GAPS diet. I referred them to science-based medicine and warned them about becoming scientifically literate and staying safe. And that no, again, sorry, I can't give you diet advice. She kept asking and then went on to say that official diet advice had been wrong before, so why should she listen to it? Nothing had helped her, and that the paleo diet is, in fact, scientifically backed. All I could do was refer her again to many online resources as possible, but it leaves people in a very awkward situation when there are not necessarily that many places you can actually drive people to with approachable diet advice. People are desperate for answers and desperate for help. I'm 28 now, and I have the quality of life of someone 4 times my age. I struggle every day to get out of bed and find ways to work and live and do all the things that someone in their 20s should do. So when these seemingly innocent options are floated in front of my eyes, it's really hard to avoid them. We must never deride people for looking for help elsewhere, and work hard to make sure that we can play wellness at its own game. We're seeing great strides, and I'm excited to see what's to come. Thank you.